Okay, so we've had a recession, let's say, or we're in a recession, and we want to know, well, how is the economy going to recover? So in all the graphs that I had before, even after the Great Depression, real GDP and unemployment came back, right? So even in the Great Depression, we had a big decrease in real GDP, a big increase in the unemployment rate. But eventually, all of those things came back towards the trend line, right? Real GDP increased, the unemployment rate came back down. And so, how is that happening and why is it happening? And there's really two possibilities. One is the labor demand curve is going to shift back to the right on its own due to various market forces. Or it could be that there's some government intervention that is causing the labor demand curve to shift back to the right. And so the question is, which one is it, and how do each of those things work? So we're going to start with the first one, shifts on its own due to market forces. And so what's going on here is, remember that labor demand went down in the first place because the value of the marginal product went down. So either the marginal product of labor decreased or the price decreased, whichever was the case. Now, eventually, those things are going to be temporary blips. So if you look at, in the long run, in longer periods of time, we're more productive, right? So workers are getting more productive. You're going to school. The state of knowledge is always improving. Technology is always improving. We're always innovating, and over time, especially longer periods of time, we're always becoming more productive. So over the course of 10 years, you're going to see big increases in the marginal product of labor. And those are going to always dominate over the long run. So what's caused our trend line of increasing economic growth is ultimately these increases in the marginal product of labor, our technology that we called it way back in chapter 6 when we discussed economic growth. So ultimately that is going to win out. And there's lots of different micro explanations for what's going on there. And we'll kind of touch on those when we understand each of the possible explanations for why labor demand decreased in the first place. But for now, we can take comfort in knowing that even if we did nothing, over a long period of time, these increases in productivity are going to win out. So that when we have a recession, I'll start us off in a recession here. Labor supply. And let's say we're down here. Oops, let me go. Oh, I lost it all. All right. So here's labor supply. Here's labor demand. I'll start us off with the downward rigid wage case where we get a fairly big unemployment rate there as a result of decrease in labor demand. Now, eventually, as the marginal product of labor increases, we are going to move our way back towards what we call full employment, right? So if we do nothing else, market forces are going to tend to push us with our own innovations towards an improving situation. Now, the question becomes, how long does that take on its own? And really, in the end, there's no way of knowing what the answer to that is, because we can't run the type of experiments that you could in the sciences. I can't say, let's have one recession where we have no interventions by the government or the Federal Reserve, and then let's have another recession where we do particular interventions, right? We don't get that luxury in economics, and so we never fully know how long it would take for labor demand to shift back on its own. So, all right, that's one possibility, is eventually we'll come back on our own. How long it takes, we don't know, which is where we get into the expansionary policies. Now, monetary policy is the Federal Reserve. And so if you remember, in our chapter on banking and the monetary system, the Federal Reserve has a target interest rate, the federal funds rate, that it changes up and down in hopes of influencing the economy. Now, in the next chapter, we'll dive into a little bit more details of monetary policy and fiscal policy. But for here, I'm going to focus on fiscal policy, which is government spending and taxing. And when we have a recession, both of these policies tend to be used. And in an expansionary policy, we're trying to increase employment and real GDP. And so there are various mechanisms that we can use to get there. So what about fiscal policy, government spending and taxes? Well, in expansionary fiscal policy means I'm going to increase government spending. So the government buys more stuff. Right? So if people aren't buying things in the economy as part of a recession, the government says, well, we're going to buy more stuff. So we'll just start building things, build some roads, we'll buy some airplanes, we'll do some other stuff. And by doing that, our hope is to increase labor demand. So the government is going to cause firms to hire workers because they have to fulfill the demand that the government is giving them, right? I want to buy some planes. Well, then Boeing needs to hire some additional workers to make the planes. So that's one way the government can do it. They can also decrease our taxes. So they can decrease tax rates. And the goal of decreasing tax rates is to stimulate economic activity. So I can decrease tax rates, particularly on firms, and that hopefully causes them to increase the amount of workers they want to hire. It's going to shift labor demand to the right. Or, as what we've done most recently, is I could give tax rebates. So a tax rebate is really just a transfer. I'm going to give you some money. I'm going to give you $1,200, right? Or I'm going to give rebates or money to firms. And the goal of those is to get people to either spend money or get firms to use it on their workers, right? So the idea is hopefully that we spend more, and that is going to stimulate our labor demand. So we'll get into specifically, why labor demand might decrease and what role overall demand for goods may play in that. But the goal of the expansionary policy is to ultimately cause labor demand to increase faster. And so I could decrease tax rates if I'm the government and hope to stimulate demand for labor, or I can just flat out give consumers and firms money, which is kind of what the government has done most recently in this coronavirus stimulus, was mostly loans and handouts or payments, tax rebates to consumers and firms. And the idea of that is to hopefully cause labor demand to shift back to the right, at least partially. And so the ultimate goal of these, if I draw my labor market, if here we are in a recession, I want to try to shift labor demand to the right faster than what would happen if we did nothing. That is the goal of expansionary policy. So I know it's a little bit hazy. I haven't gone into the details, and that's on purpose. In the next chapter, we're going to go into the specifics of how government policy works, but at least you have some ideas here that you probably already had before, right? If the government decreases the tax rate, that is going to cause labor demand to shift to the right. Employment goes up, real GDP goes up. That is the main idea there. Okay, so we will cover an expansion next, and then we will be done with learning objective 6.